Well, we were very pleased to get the first session on the first day, so maybe there's some technology challenges with that. But we are here to talk about an important topic. I'm glad to see the interest from the group here. You all made travels and faced the challenges of traveling during the time of COVID, and we really appreciate it. You're going to be glad to hear that the majority of what you hear today will be from Prakash rather than myself. I have some experience with standards organizations, but not that much with 3GPP. And I think that makes me maybe not too different from a lot of the people in the utility industry. This is, we all use our cell phones and we depend on this organization, but the ins and outs of how it works have not been that important to learn until, I would say, now. We have some big developments going on and adoption of, obviously, public 4G and 5G services to support our operations, but also private networks, and some of those private networks have specific characteristics. We have this introduction from Prakash Sangam, who is an analyst but with a deep technical background. He's participated in the technical committees in 3GPP for many years and can describe how that works. I'm going to talk just a little bit more as the presentation goes on about what this could mean for utilities. So first step will be introducing the structure, then who is involved, right? So mostly not utility organizations, mostly cellular related organizations, wireless organizations. And why should this matter? Obviously, we have a long history in the utility space of using industrial radios that are really designed very specifically to meet the demands and unusual and stringent demands that are faced by the utility industry. Well, what does 3GP bring? Being in the cellular world, is that a plus? Is that a minus? I think what you're going to find as you look at it is depends on the application. There are times when having the giant standards body and the volumes associated with the cellular world are very valuable. There are other times when you have a particular application that is really more suited to industrial radios. So that's what we'll be discussing. And then at the end, I'm going to ask a question of you. You'll have a chance to ask questions as well. And by the way, even though we got a late start, if there's a question or two as we go through here, I think that would be okay. We'll watch the time, obviously, to make sure we get you guys done on time. But if you want to raise your hand as we go, and there'll be a Q&A at the end as well. But the question I'll be asking you is are the utilities and UTC involved as they should be enough as to really make sure that as these standards come out, they also support the utilities' requirements. So with that, I'll turn it over to Prakash Sangam.
Thanks, Bob. In terms of a quick introduction, Prakash Sangam, as Bob mentioned, I've been in telecom field for more than 25 years now, working for AT&T, Ericsson, and most recently Telecom. About 3 years ago, I started my own industry analyst business. I'm a full-time 3GPP member, attend all those meetings and such, and a lot of background in standards and patterns and everything and so on. So, before starting 3GPP and what it is and other stuff, you might be asking why bother, right? 3GPP is over telecom, why should we bother? Let me give you a simple example that shows the value of 3GPP. I mean, we have had electricity for like close to 200 years now, but even now when you go to say France, you have to look for an adapter. If you have a US plug, you go to UK, you need a different adapter. You go to India, China, Japan, different adapters, right? But when you consider smartphones, which have been around like what, last 10 years or so, you don't have to look for adapters. And that's the value of 3GPP. That's the value of global standardization, right? It's been driving standardization since 2G days, although the name 3GPP stands for 3G, Third Generation Partnership Project. It was conceived and constituted in, I think, 1998. The main objective at that time was basically come up with the harmonized global standards for mobile communications. And if you know, and as old as I am, looking back at 2G, when you look at 1G or 2G, there are different standards everywhere in the world. US has its own standard, Japan has its own, Europe had its own, and a lot of places there were no cell phones at that time. So 3GPP was constituted to come up with a common global standard, but unfortunately did not achieve that target for 3G because 3G ended up having 5 global standards, one for Europe, one for US, and for Japan, another for China, and so on. But it did achieve its target in 4G. 4G was a single global standard. As I said, it's been around for more than 20 years. There have been 16 releases, so every specification or standard that comes of 3GPP is in terms of a release, and you have a release roughly, depending on how these standards are happening, one every year or every other year. So we have had so far 16 releases. The last one was release 16, finalized June of last year. And there is work happening on 17, which is expected to be standardized early next year. And 18 work started as well, and so on. There are more than 1,500 specifications, actual specification documents that 3GPP has produced so far, and it keeps on increasing as we move forward with different Gs. There are close to 100 member companies who are actually full-time members of 3GPP. If you have anything to do with telecom or wireless, it makes sense for you to be part of 3GPP, especially if you are in the leadership role and you are trying to make something work, in the globe. Any major telecom industry, you name it, are members of 3GPP. Some play very active roles, some don't, but nonetheless, most of them are members of the group itself. Obviously, tons of work done, lots of meetings, close to 6 to 8 on average every year, and that's where most of the standardization and agreement is being done, but a lot of work happens behind the doors before these actual meetings as well. So, as you've seen, from 2G was a part of 3GPP, which was Europeans at that time worked on 2G, so that's just on that slide. But 3G obviously is full work of 3GPP, and there was parallel track called 3GPP2 for US that didn't last long, which was working on CDMA. 4G, as I mentioned, was the first really single global standard. And obviously 5G is taking to the next notch. There's work happening on what's called as 5G Advanced, and which could be a starting step to 6G as well. And obviously, I'm sure I'm going to talk about the mobile revolution that has enabled, right? So, although it started, the standardization started with only, started with voice services and then brought onto data with LTE, but the standardization has impacted many more parts of the economy. With 5G, I'm sure there's a lot of hype about it. You have heard quite a lot about it, but I'm very confident there won't be any technology or any industry as such in the world that will not be touched by 5G at some point of time, in the future. I know tons of them. I'll not go through all of them. Look at TV broadcast, for example, will have a 5G option. For example, utilities have been very early users of wireless technology that come out of 3GPP and are one of the major verticals. So there is a lot of push in 3GPP itself to make sure to coalesce all the industry, leaders, standards organization in utilities, so that whatever standards that come out of 3GPP are directly relevant and readily usable for the industry. If you quickly go back in 3G or even early parts of 4G, the only focus was on mobile communications for broadband, smartphones, and so on. But the shift has kind of shifted slightly with release 15, more so with 16 and 17, wherein the focus now is how to enable the verticals to better make use of this technology that 3GPP is working on as such. So verticals are a major focus area for anything that you do in 3GPP nowadays. And 3GPP specifications and the work, it's in very iterative process. The standard, kind of a joke is anything more you want to get done, major ones, not these small, updates here and there, you introduce in one release, and it actually will be in a full-blown specification in the next release. Started with 3G. Remember I mentioned 3GPP started to come up with the harmonized global standard, but actually was realized in 4G. Similarly, any techniques that you see here, they were introduced in one of the releases, and then they go full-blown in the next release. So if you look at LTE, which is a global 4G standard, it was introduced in release 8. I think that was finalized in either 2008 or 9. And then there was release 9. So usually you have a major release. After that, kind of bug fixing or update kind of release, 1 or 2, and you have another major release as well. So release 18 was LTE, and then release 10 was LTE Advanced, and release 13 was LTE Advanced Pro, and release 15 was 5G. So since it is an iterative process, you will see a lot of advanced, enhanced, further enhanced, extremely further enhanced, and so on in most of the technology names. Yeah, so there's a lot of back and forth that happens, and everything as in with any standards organization, it is consensus driven, and it's really interesting to watch how bitter enemies in the marketplace, competitors, come together to come out with a consensus-based specification for the industry. And it takes a lot of time, and it's very detail-oriented because engineers talking across the board. People can be stubborn a lot of times, but some things get done. They take time, but they definitely get done at the end of the day. 3GPP itself is comprised of 7 what are called as regional SSOs. SSO stands for Standard Setting Organization. It's kind of, technically it is not correct to say that 3GPP makes standards. 3GPP only prepares specifications. Actually, these regional SSOs take those specifications and convert that into a standard. More than 90% of the time, they basically rubber stamp whatever specifications 3GPP comes up with and make the standards for their region. Sometimes they do some regional variations, changes to suit the local requirements as well. As you can see, that they represent almost most of the world. Everywhere else, basically, they don't have, like for example, Africa, they don't have an organization that contributes or is part of 3GPP because there is nothing that is equivalent to any of these guys in Europe. In Africa, probably it will be there'll be one soon when it becomes really when African operators realize that they have to play a key role in standardization itself. Otherwise, there is one for Americas, and actually 2 for Japan, for historical reasons. There is one for Europe, there is one for India and China as well. And these not only they standardize what 3GPP, the specifications that 3GPP comes up with, they also give feedback into 3GPP in terms of requirements of the industries and others. And it's, although these are names of organizations, ultimately the members are actual companies themselves, so the representatives of the industry companies that go in and develop standards and so on. So there is a good feedback process and a closed loop kind of a thing where the industry requirements are fed in and the specifications are prepared to address those needs and wants of the market. In terms of organization structure, it's divided into multiple groups, and these groups are divided into kind of 3 streams. The first one is obviously RAN, Radio Access Network. There's one for services and system aspects, which are a little bit high level, and then core network ones, right? And obviously RAN is the biggest group, and it has 5 to 6 subgroups, which are called as working groups. That's where most of the work is done. And each of the stream is called a technical specification group, TSG, you might have heard. There is a RAN TSG, there is a SA TSG, and a core network TSG, or CNTSG. We'll touch upon some of the spectrum aspects which are relevant to utilities, and those are primarily discussed in RAN 4 or RAN Working Group 4, but everything has to be ultimately approved by the TSG, which is the RAN TSG in this case. Or if there are any dependencies on core network or services layer and so on, those have to be approved by those TSGs as well. So there's a lot of interaction that happens between. And if you look at it, it's 3GPP work is very thorough. If you have one document, you probably see close to 100 documents referenced in one document. So if you just can't, if you just can't jump in and try to understand it all. You need a lot of history to understand how to work within 3GPP. And obviously there are lots of examples, research around major big companies trying to change how things work and trying to dismantle or come up with their own, have found it very hard to work within 3GPP. So how the work gets done, 3GPP, as I said, doesn't do technologies at all. It only does specifications. Actually, technologies come from outside, from member companies. Could be Ericsson, Qualcomm, could be operators as well. A lot of times it is mostly vendors who come with technologies, and then they basically propose, into the standard. Project is created, and then people discuss on it. If there are aspects or things that needs to be standardized, then it goes into what is called as a study item, wherein all the member companies take the technology back, study, and give their either contributions or feedback on what needs to happen in terms of standards. A lot of times when they look at this concept, it's not useful, not performing according to the needs, then it's shared. But more often than not, people agree that it needs to be standardized. And once collectively people agree that it needs to be standardized, it goes from what is called as a study item into a work item. And work item is the phase during which actual specifications are written, and then they are finalized in the course of time. So these steps are proposal, feasibility study, which is study item, and then actual development, which is a work item. So one of the things that we are working with 3GPP on for utility industries is certifying one of the bands used in the US for utility, and a lot of utilities are using it, recognizing that band as a 3GPP band. And there are tons of reasons why you want to do that. I think Bob will capture some of those in the later slides. So it's specifically, it's a 1 + 1 megahertz spectrum in this upper 700 megahertz band in the US, the actual frequencies given there. More than 20 utilities own this spectrum. Some are owned by investors as well. And currently, proprietary technologies are being used there. We see a lot of value in bringing NB-IoT to that spectrum. In fact, there is a live network which has been live for last 2 years in Florida based on NB-IoT using this spectrum. You might ask, if it's already working, why you need standardization right now? If any band is not standardized by 3GPP, then the vendors have to do their own testing specifically for these deployments. And then in terms of specifications, you don't know the equipment, be it devices or the network that you are getting from the vendors, whether it complies with all the requirements of FCC for that band or not, whether it complies with the 3GPP requirements for that band or not. So you have to do your own additional testing if you want to use that band for NB-IoT right now. If it becomes a 3GPP standard, then any equipment that comes out of vendors which complies with 3GPP standards will support this band without any, and there's no additional testing or compliance testing or anything of that sort is needed. So it is very key in terms of making it very efficient in terms of deployment and so on that we certified. And formally, when we have started this process a couple of months ago, I think up to 5 utilities have already agreed to supporting us in the standardization process, and more support is on the way as well. What is the plan? Although it's a proposed plan, some of this thing is already done. The first one was basically looking at what is the best way to standardize. I mean, because it's a very narrow band spectrum, just 1 megahertz. We looked at many options. The best, most optimal option that we think is standardizing it as a standalone NB-IoT only band. We looked at a band combination with the surrounding bands. Lots of complications. I'll go into that a little bit in the next slide. But we think the best option would be to standardize it as a standalone NB-IoT band. And then we have consulted with the neighboring owners, spectrum owners. It is in between band 13 and 14. Those discussions have gone very well. And we have talked to a lot of interested parties. And in terms of standardization itself, we actually formally submitted what is called as a discussion document showing the intent to standardize to RAN 4. So that's where it starts. Then ultimately the actual submission happens in RAN TSG, as I said, the first long group that I've shown. So we shared the discussion document and our intent to standardize with RAN 4 this month. The RAN 4 actual meeting is happening right now. It started last week and it will run till the end of this week. And in September, second week, the RAN TSG plenary is starting. So we will formally submit the work item description WID to our interest. We will support people who have questions or want to look at it more closely. They have a chance to comment and participate in the discussion as well. And hopefully at the end of the discussion, the band will be certified. We don't really see any major hurdles so far that we have worked on it. So, but we'll see actually the process once it is formally submitted and next bit into RAN TSG. Some details on the proposed band. As I said, it's nestled between 13 and 14, owned by AT&T and Verizon for FirstNet with AT&T specifically. Why we are saying it, the standalone NB-IoT band is most optimal because being independent on its own makes it ideal for private IoT applications like utilities. You don't have to work with other spectrum owners and so on. You can deploy your network. It's a lot of freedom on how you deploy, manage, and run the network. And then, if it is a standalone band versus a combined band with other spectrum, there's no complexity of spectrum ownership in terms of territoriality or the FCC requirements and so on. Obviously, the regulatory requirements are different for different bands. If you combine them, then a lot of complexities on how to address those and so on. If it is standalone, it stands on its own and with its own FCC requirements. And it's already been implemented, a standard network. It's already fully standard-based network. Is already in operation in Florida for a utility called GEA. Some salient points of the actual deployment here. It's a 3-site network covering 1.6 million POPs. It's obviously in standalone mode. It complies fully with the transmission mass requirements of FCC, and it uses the full 3GPP NB-IoT stack. So the only difference between this network and a 3GPP standardized network would be that there will be a piece of paper from 3GPP saying this band is certified with 3GPP and this is a band number. I'm sure you know the band number, so there will be a band number for it. That will be, most likely that is the only difference between this and a 3GPP band certified network, realistically. And all of the vendors used in the network and the equipment is from telecom vendors, reputed telecom vendors. It's not a proprietary solution or something like that. So that's kind of end of the GPP. If you have any questions, feel free. Otherwise, I kind of to Rob to continue this presentation. Yeah.
Hello. Quick question with respect to quick question with respect to that GOB and megahertz that 1 megahertz NB-IoT.
Yeah.
If there is already a proprietary network on that band, now with this classification, does that mean that that network would have to be replaced with a standardized IoT?
No, it's basically nothing. If it's basically an additional option, I would say much better option for anybody who owns a spectrum. If you already have a proprietary network or you are planning to do a proprietary network in the future, nothing changes. It can exactly go as is. But if you deploy NB-IoT in that spectrum, there are tons of advantages that you get as well as your neighbors get, because the interaction, interworking between different LTE network, for example, which is on the neighboring band and this band, have been worked on, and the issues on collaborating between these two networks has been worked on and known for a very long time. Right, and the stack and how the technology works, there's a lot of similarity between the two, and it's all very known, and it's all any things that might be already been worked out. If it is a proprietary system, there's a lot of unknowns, and it is very specific to that proprietary technology. If you enter into a situation for whatever reason, then it's very hard. You have to work on its own, and then a lot of issues with that. If you go with any standard technology, any possible interworking scenarios have been worked out, so it's much better for you as a owner of the network, as well as the neighbors of neighboring networks as well, right? But nothing changes if you're a proprietary network or planning to do one in the future.
And so the guidance for filtering for the neighboring bands, that's set up by the
Yeah, so the band, the out of bands, transmissions and how should roll off be, those are more of a FCC requirement. 3GPP has some requirements on how the band scheme for the NB-IoT and what is the guard band between the carriers and so on. But overall, if you are owner of the spectrum, whatever 1 megahertz, 1+1, the out of band transmission requirements are mandated by FCC, not by 3GPP.
Okay. That's all right. So the filtering characteristics are mandated by the out of band characteristics are mandated by the FCC.
Correct. As a spectrum owner, you have to comply with the FCC rules. Yeah.
Yeah, I think to give an additional perspective, we really see that NB-IoT has a certain set of applications, right? It's very long range, can be potentially low cost to lots of remote devices, but it has a higher latency than a lot of the industrial radios. It doesn't have as much throughput as a lot of the industrial radios. So my answer to that would be, there's no best solution until you declare what your application or applications are. And then, it's really up to the engineers to figure out, okay, what's the best solution for us? Yes, I absolutely do agree, though. We're in the business of selling the spectrum, so part of the objective here is to say, what additional applications are there, other ways that it can be used? About a third of the country, over 20 utilities have these licenses so far. There's another 2/3 we're still trying to sell, so we're trying to help these additional applications come along. And I should say that the investor spectrum owners, Beach Point and Access Spectrum, have paid to hire the experts like Prakash to take this through. But we do still very much want your support. And it's 6 utilities, actually. We're up to 6 utilities plus UTC have signed off on the letter so far. So I had hoped, actually, to have more on what the other spectrum owners are doing with these licenses. So I had the pleasure of working with a bunch of folks who are now at Anterix, and I called them up and I said, would you like me to relay what you're doing at 3GPP? Because they are working and they've been working diligently to get changes made to make the band better for utilities. But they did not want to comment, so I don't have anything official. If you want to ask me a question at the end, I'll give you my speculation. CBRS has been an important band for utilities, or at least a band of interest. The 365 obviously was a big band that many utilities started using. So there has been a lot of 3GPP development in this area. It's an officially designated band. It has the spectrum sharing and all of the kind of unique attributes of that band. So there's been a lot of development there, mostly more for the carrier and consumer market. There's certainly some industrial stuff going on in that as well. And then I would say there are other bands coming, in my opinion, that we're going to see that are making themselves available to utilities, and they'll be going through 3GPP designation as well, and activity as well. That's my prediction. We'll see if it comes true or not. So I think we've hit some of these reasons why. Because of the massive, we're literally producing many, many billions of devices a year that meet 3GPP standards, right? So that's higher than any industrial radio can do, and we all know there's economies of scale. So it doesn't necessarily mean your infrastructure, your base station is going to be less expensive, but the remote devices should be significantly less expensive. Prakash mentioned interoperability, so the idea of being able to have two different base station vendors but have a compatible network, or a dozen different suppliers of endpoints that all work with your same base stations. I think that gives a lot more flexibility. If you start to think about line fault sensors or gas meters or water pressure sensors, there's a variety of different entities out there. They can basically buy modules from radio suppliers, companies like Telecom, plug those straight into their devices, and they're good to go, right? So you don't have to have every supplier be an expert in the radio end of the business. I think that's a huge advantage. There is obviously immense concern, justifiable concern about security. So private networks help get you, I think, some additional degree of security that you might not otherwise get. But public networks are exposed to all of the threat actors out there, and so 3GPP has been heavily involved in developing security for these systems. So potentially that could be the best of both worlds. Private network buys you additional security, but you're also getting all of the additional security developments that are continuously being added. And it does put you on a technology path where you're getting not just the efforts of a single supplier, but multiple suppliers. So I could see that as being an advantage. And as we said, if you decide to continue to operate your existing network, that's fine, depending on how much spectrum you're using in that existing network. If you've got an extra few hundred kilohertz left over, potentially you could have a stand side by side, right? An NB-IoT single carrier that only takes 200 kilohertz, along with whatever industrial radio you're deciding to use. So I think based on that, some significant advantages to consider, depending on what your application is for 3GPP, or for once the 3GPP standard is approved. I might add, although we have 6 signatories so far, we'd still like to have more support. If you come by my booth, it's right by the entrance to the hall. We'll be glad to show you the letter, and you can take it back, or if you feel ready to sign. It's not obligatory. It doesn't say you're going to buy spectrum. It doesn't say you're going to use the spectrum. It just says, hey, you think the standardization is a good idea. And so we've had so far signatures: First Energy, Western Farmers, Idaho Power, Puget Sound, Power South, and Salt River Projects. So some pretty important names there. And UTC has been supportive of this standardization effort as well. So I think the next step, we're going to talk a little bit about how utilities could support. Is that worthwhile?
As I mentioned, there's a lot of focus in 3GPP to support the verticals. It is one of the top candidates, users of the technology. It's an early user of technology as well. But the question is, if you want to play a key role, the first question is why you want to play a key role. A lot of times, verticals basically take what 3GPP does and try to adapt it to their needs, but there is no need to make that extra step. Actually, if you are, as an industry, inclined, there are many ways to feed in your inputs into the standardization process so that any standards come out are already incorporating the needs of that industry, right? And there are a lot of examples, some of them here. One of the, you could be, the individual companies could be directly contributors as well, or the 3GPP members. It's not that expensive. You have to go to, if you are in US, you go to say, become a member of UTC, and then through that you become member of 3GPP and so on. And that's always a best option if you want to play a key role and really plugged into what's happening. The other option as an industry to participate is this market representative partner. As an industry, UTC could be one of those entities that become a recognized official market representative partner. That has a lot of advantages. One main being you're plugged into what's happening, and there are set channels for you to feed in your inputs so that whoever is developing standards of these companies, they are in tune with what the industry needs. And in many cases, in almost all of the cases, the guys who are working on the standards are vendors and suppliers, and if they hear from actual users of those networks and devices that they put out, even better for them, right? So that's the whole objective of this program. So the automotive industry, many others are part of these what are called as market representatives of 3GPP. That's one way to be associated with it. It's basically representing the alliance of your industry, and you give requirements, as I mentioned. And also a lot of times, what each of the parts of the industry need might be different. Be it, performance, be it timing, some might need right now, some might need features later. Without active input from the industry, everybody who's developing standards or even products later are guessing. So this basically makes perfect sense for you to give your feedback to the right guys so that you get technology that works for you right off the chart. That I think we open up for questions. If you can ask one here. If you're online and asking questions, I think there is a ask a chat option, I think, for you to ask a question. And if you want to connect with us later, some of the connections here. And actually have an ongoing article series, basically demystifying, cellular standardization and patents as well. Written in RCR Wireless News, a couple of articles on Forbes as well. If you go to that link, you can basically get all these. It's an ongoing series. I keep updating, writing articles on whenever any new major development happens in the standards. For example, release 16 was finalized last year. Release 17 substantial work has completed and was completed end of last year. Release 18 work started a couple of weeks ago. So I basically keep updated on what's happening in 3GPP. And if you want to refer it and don't want to spend hours together researching what's happening, you can just check that link out. Any other questions? Any other questions online as well?
I'm not online. I don't know whether, but since we're not streaming, I don't think we're going to get questions online. I don't know if you answered this earlier. Why haven't they gotten around to changing? Why isn't it 5GPP?
I mean, a couple of ways. I don't know there is any official answer. I can give my perspective on it. One is, I mean, it's very, 3GPP has very thin marketing and BD staff, like many alliances, because they don't have to do a lot of marketing. I think it's one person. So, and it's too much effort with so many companies involved. Coming up with is too much effort. They would rather put that effort in coming with good standards other than changing the name. And the name is transient, right? I mean, if 5G today, and then what happens in a couple of years, 6G, how many times you keep changing? I'll show a quick example of it. I mean, I must speak a little bit with that. 5G Americas started with 4G Americas, and then they waited, and then say, oh, you know, we have 5G, they have to change 5G. I've asked them, will you change when it happens, when 6G comes along? They don't know. So something that is, it is not time bound. I think, you know, it's not smart to keep changing every time there is a new generation. And at some point of time that 3G, nobody will bother about the full form of 3GPP. It might be just a name of the organization, right? So.
Any questions out there regarding either spectrum in general, which is sort of my topic, or the standard situation? I guess one thing I would mention as far as 700 is there in addition to the call them proprietary or call them individual company solutions, there is also an IEEE standard, right? It's 802.16s, and they're now in the process of migrating that. But it's a narrow channel WiMAX is essentially there. It's a standard that I think is currently supported primarily by Ondas, but there's other companies that they're looking into that as well. So that's an interesting, even narrower than narrowband. They're trying to go down, I think, at 5 kHz or something like that standards. That may be an option, and there's been some support from that from other vendors and from the rail industry as well as from utilities. So that's another one to keep in mind. I guess the point I was trying to make earlier is I think the comment we had yesterday from Ameren, from John Hughes, was that they're spending 8% of their budget for their upcoming field area network on spectrum. Well, 8% was $50 million. It was the publicly announced number by Anterix, right? It's a public company. They've got to announce that. So you look at that, that's a $500 million kind of project. And that's just one utility. And so, to me, first of all, that's great, right? It's good to see the kind of investment in communications going on at utilities to support their operations. I think it's necessary. I think it's a wise move. But secondly, it says, paying attention to what's going on, and then that's based on a 3GPP approach to 4G network. It argues that maybe utilities should invest more in the standards to make sure, because this is being driven by the consumer industry and consumer wireless. So just something for you to think about. Certainly, one thing I'd say is if you are interested in supporting this, if it sounds good, come by my booth. I'll have a letter that you can sign to support this, or at least examine it and see if you want to do that. Okay, that was my comments. Any questions? All right, well, it looks like we finished early, started late, finished early, that's good. Thank you everyone for joining us today.